The morning mist clung to the red clay hills surrounding Sanh combat base like a death shroud. At first, Lieutenant Michael Rodriguez couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was coming. He stood atop the eastern bunker line, watching North Vietnamese Army spotters disappear into the jungle tree line just beyond the range of his Marines' rifles. It was January 20th, 1968, and the 6,000 Marines stationed at this remote outpost near the demilitarized zone had no idea they were about to face one of the longest and most brutal sieges in American military history. Colonel David Lones, the commanding officer of the 26th Marine Regiment, had been receiving intelligence reports for weeks about massive enemy troop buildups in the surrounding mountains. The North Vietnamese had been moving entire divisions through the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and reconnaissance flights showed an estimated 40,000 enemy soldiers positioned in a tightening circle around their isolated fire base. The base, originally established to monitor communist infiltration routes and support indigenous forces in the region, had become a strategic prize that both sides were willing to fight to the death to control. Rodriguez watched his men going about their morning routines, cleaning weapons and reinforcing bunkers with sandbags and timber. These were hardened combat veterans of the 3rd Battalion, 26th Marines, men who had already survived months of jungle warfare and ambushes along the DMZ. Sergeant Major William Harper, a grizzled Korean War veteran, moved between the positions with the easy confidence of a man who had seen it all before. But even Harper seemed more alert than usual, his weathered face scanning the horizon with the instinctive wariness of a predator sensing danger. The base itself was a sprawling complex of bunkers, trenches, at fortified positions carved into the hills of northwestern Quang Tri Province. An airstrip ran down the center of the base, essential for resupply and medical evacuation. But it was becoming increasingly dangerous as enemy artillery spotters moved closer to the perimeter. Supply convoys from the coast had become nearly impossible, with Highway 9 under constant attack from communist forces, who controlled most of the mountainous terrain between Sanh and the outside world. According to declassified military documents from the National Archives, North Vietnamese General Vo Nguyen Giap had been planning this offensive for over a year, viewing Sanh as the key to drawing American forces away from major population centers. Captain James Mitchell of Alpha Company studied the latest intelligence reports in the command bunker, noting the steady increase in enemy radio traffic and the discovery of fresh rocket positions in the hills. His company held the northern perimeter, the most likely avenue of approach for a major assault, and his Marines had been working around the clock to improve their defensive positions. The men knew something big was coming, and they could feel the tension building like electricity in the air before a thunderstorm. As the sun climbed higher over the jungle canopy, Rodriguez noticed that the usual sounds of the Vietnamese countryside had fallen silent. No birds sang in the trees, no insects buzzed in the undergrowth, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. In his gut, he knew that this eerie quiet meant only one thing: the enemy was moving into position for something massive, and when it came, it would test every ounce of courage and determination these Marines possessed in the days and weeks ahead. At exactly 5:30 in the morning on January 21st, 1968, the earth around Sanh exploded in a symphony of death and destruction that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Lieutenant Rodriguez was shaving in his bunker when the first barrage of North Vietnamese rockets and artillery shells began falling like a steel rain across the Marine base, transforming the quiet morning into a nightmare of fire and shrapnel that announced the beginning of the longest siege in Vietnam War history. The initial bombardment was unlike anything the Marines had experienced before, with over 300 rounds of rocket and artillery fire crashing into their positions. In the first hour alone, Colonel Lones rushed to the command bunker as explosions rocked the base, dust and debris cascading from the reinforced ceiling with each impact. Communications with the outside world became sporadic as radio antennas were destroyed and telephone lines severed by the relentless pounding of enemy guns positioned in the hills. Overlooking their positions, Captain Mitchell's Alpha Company bore the brunt of the initial assault, with North Vietnamese forces launching coordinated attacks against the northern perimeter while maintaining the devastating artillery barrage. His Marines, many of them teenagers from small towns across America, hugged the bottom of their trenches as shells exploded overhead, sending geysers of red clay and metal fragments in all directions. The sound was indescribable, a constant roar of explosions, punctuated by the screams of wounded men and the frantic shouts of squad leaders trying to maintain control of their units. Sergeant Major Harper moved through the chaos like a man possessed, crawling from bunker to bunker to check on his Marines and coordinate the defense. His years of experience had taught him that the first few hours of any battle were crucial, and he could see that this was no ordinary attack. The enemy had planned this assault with meticulous care, timing their strikes to coincide with poor weather that grounded most American air support and made resupply virtually impossible. The Marine defenders quickly realized they were facing a new kind of warfare, as North Vietnamese sappers began infiltrating their perimeter under cover of the artillery barrage. These were elite soldiers trained in demolitions and close-quarters combat, moving through the wire obstacles and minefields with deadly precision. First Lieutenant Thomas Mahoney of Bravo Company watched in horror as enemy commandos emerged from the morning mist like ghosts, their faces painted with mud and their weapons gleaming in the flickering light of burning fuel dumps. As the first day of the siege wore on, it became clear that the North Vietnamese had achieved complete tactical surprise and numerical superiority. Radio intercepts revealed that General Giap had positioned the full divisions in the mountains surrounding Khe Sanh, with additional regiments moving south from the DMZ to join the assault. The Marines were outnumbered nearly 7-1, with limited ammunition and no possibility of immediate reinforcement due to the intensity of enemy fire on the airstrip. Rodriguez found himself leading a desperate counterattack against North Vietnamese forces that had penetrated the eastern perimeter, his Marines advancing through a hellscape of smoke and flame, while enemy mortars continued to rain death from above. The fighting was brutal and intimate, often hand-to-hand combat in the narrow confines of bunkers and trenches, where survival depended on split-second reflexes and the willingness to kill, or be killed without hesitation. By nightfall on January 21st, the Marines had managed to hold their positions, but at a terrible cost. The medical bunkers were overflowing with wounded men, and the base's ammunition supply had been dangerously depleted by the ferocity of the fighting. As Rodriguez looked out at the enemy positions glowing with muzzle flashes in the darkness, he realized that this was just the beginning of what would become the most harrowing test of Marine Corps' courage and determination in the entire Vietnam conflict. The second day of the siege dawned gray and ominous as Lieutenant Rodriguez surveyed the devastation that had transformed Khe Sanh Combat Base into a moonscape of craters and twisted metal. The North Vietnamese bombardment had continued throughout the night with methodical precision, each shell seemingly aimed at breaking the will of the Marines who crouched in their bunkers, like animals trapped in a maze of death and destruction. Colonel Lones established a new routine of survival that would define the next 75 days of the siege, organizing his remaining forces into tight defensive sectors, while coordinating desperately needed air support for Marine and Air Force squadrons based hundreds of miles away. The enemy had effectively cut off all ground access to Khe Sanh, making aerial resupply the only lifeline between the besieged Marines and the outside world. But even that connection was tenuous, as North Vietnamese anti-aircraft guns made every landing a potentially fatal gamble. Captain Mitchell's Alpha Company had lost nearly 30% of its strength in the first 48 hours of fighting, but the survivors adapted to their new reality with the grim determination that had made the Marine Corps legendary. They learned to sleep in shifts while maintaining constant vigilance, to eat cold rations while shells exploded overhead, and to continue fighting even when their nerves were stretched to the breaking point by the relentless psychological warfare being waged against them. The North Vietnamese had positioned their artillery with diabolical cleverness in caves and tunnels throughout the surrounding mountains, making it nearly impossible for American air strikes to silence the guns that rained death on Khe Sanh around the clock. Every few hours, salvos of rockets and mortar rounds would crash into the base with devastating accuracy, targeting the runway, ammunition dumps, and medical facilities with the clear intention of making life unbearable for the defending Marines. Sergeant Major Harper became a legend among the troops during these dark days, moving through the most dangerous areas of the base to check on isolated outposts and maintain communication between scattered units. His mere presence seemed to steady the younger Marines who looked to him for leadership and inspiration when their world had been reduced to a few square yards of dirt and sandbags surrounded by an ocean of enemies who wanted them dead. The siege of Khe Sanh captured international attention, with major news outlets like Time magazine and the New York Times reporting daily on the plight of the trapped Marines and comparing their situation to the French disaster at Dien Bien Phu 14 years earlier. The psychological pressure of the siege began to take its toll as the days stretched into weeks, with no sign of relief or rescue. Marines who had been fearless fighters just days before began showing signs of combat exhaustion, their eyes taking on the 1,000-yard stare of men who had seen too much death and destruction. The constant threat of incoming artillery made every movement across the base a potentially fatal decision, and men learned to time their dashes between bunkers with the precision of dancers performing a deadly choreography. First Lieutenant Mahoney organized night patrols beyond the perimeter to gather intelligence on enemy positions and intentions, leading small groups of volunteers into the darkness, where North Vietnamese soldiers waited in prepared positions. These missions were exercises in controlled terror, requiring absolute silence and split-second timing as the Marines moved through enemy territory. Knowing that discovery meant certain death for the entire patrol, the medical situation became increasingly desperate as wounded Marines accumulated faster than they could be evacuated, and Corpsman James Washington worked tirelessly to save lives with dwindling supplies of medicine and surgical equipment. His aid station, located in a reinforced bunker near the center of the base, became a sanctuary where Marines could find temporary relief from the horror that surrounded them. Though even there the sound of incoming shells was a constant reminder of their precarious situation. As January drew to a close, the Marines of Sanh had already proven their ability to survive under conditions that would have broken lesser men, but they had no way of knowing that their ordeal was just beginning and that the worst days of the siege still lay ahead. February 1st, 1968, marked the beginning of what would become the most grueling phase of the Sanh siege. As the North Vietnamese shifted their strategy from direct assault to a war of attrition designed to slowly bleed the Marines dry through constant harassment and psychological pressure, Lieutenant Rodriguez had not slept more than 2 hours at a stretch in 10 days, and he could see the same bone-deep exhaustion in the faces of every Marine under his command as they struggled to maintain their fighting effectiveness under impossible conditions. The enemy had refined their artillery tactics to an evil science, timing their barrages to disrupt mealtimes, sleep periods, and medical evacuations with clockwork precision. That suggested they had infiltrated spotters within the base perimeter. Colonel Lowndes instituted new security protocols that treated every Vietnamese civilian, and even some South Vietnamese soldiers, with suspicion, knowing that intelligence leaks could mean the difference between life and death for his increasingly isolated command. Captain Mitchell discovered that his Marines were beginning to develop an almost supernatural ability to predict incoming artillery by the sound of distant gun flashes and the whistle of approaching shells. They could distinguish between different types of enemy weapons by their distinctive signatures, diving for cover at the first hint of danger with reflexes honed by weeks of constant exposure to death. This hypervigilance kept them alive, but also pushed many of them toward the edge of psychological breakdown. The resupply situation had become critical, as North Vietnamese anti-aircraft fire made daylight landings virtually suicidal for transport aircraft crews. Cargo planes were forced to make their approaches in dense fog or during brief lulls in the bombardment, often dropping their loads from dangerous altitudes rather than risking a normal landing. On the shell-cratered runway, Marines learned to scavenge everything from parachute cord to cardboard containers, transforming military garbage into essential survival equipment. Sergeant Major Harper organized work details to repair damaged fortifications during the brief intervals between artillery attacks, leading teams of Marines in desperate races against time to fill sandbags and reinforce bunkers before the next barrage began. These men worked with the frenzy of sailors plugging leaks in a sinking ship, knowing that their lives depended on maintaining the defensive positions that were all that stood between them and annihilation. The monsoon rains that began in early February turned Sanh into a quagmire of red mud and standing water that bred disease and made movement between positions a nightmare of slipping and sliding through trenches that had become open sewers. Marines developed trench foot and jungle rot at an alarming rate, and the limited medical supplies made it impossible to treat all but the most serious cases of illness and infection. First Lieutenant Mahoney's night patrols had confirmed intelligence reports that the North Vietnamese were tunneling toward the base from multiple directions. Using techniques perfected during their siege of French forces at Dien Bien Phu, the Marines began laying seismic sensors and acoustic detection devices around the perimeter, trying to identify enemy tunneling operations before sappers could emerge inside their defensive lines with devastating effect. The psychological warfare campaign intensified as North Vietnamese loudspeakers broadcast propaganda messages in English throughout the night, mixing appeals for surrender with graphic descriptions of what would happen to captured Marines. These broadcasts were interspersed with recorded sounds of American women crying and children calling for their fathers. a calculated assault on the morale of men who were already pushed to their emotional limits. Corpsman Washington reported that he was treating an increasing number of cases of combat stress reaction among Marines, who had simply reached the limit of human endurance after weeks of constant terror and violence. These men were not cowards, but rather warriors who had fought beyond the point where most people would have collapsed, and their breakdown was often triggered by relatively minor incidents that served as the final straw in an accumulation of horrors. As Valentine's Day approached, the Marines of Sanh had been under siege for 24 days with no clear indication of when their ordeal might end. They had adapted to their hellish environment with the resourcefulness and tenacity that defined American fighting men, but everyone from Colonel Lones to the newest private knew that they could not sustain this level of combat indefinitely without reinforcement or relief. The morning of February 15th brought news that shook the defenders of Sanh to their core, when reconnaissance patrols reported massive North Vietnamese troop movements converging on their positions from 3 directions simultaneously. Lieutenant Rodriguez received orders to prepare his sector for what intelligence officers believed would be the final, all-out assault designed to overrun the base before American reinforcements could arrive. And he could see the mixture of fear and determination in his Marines' eyes as they checked their weapons and said quiet prayers. Colonel Lones called an emergency meeting of his company commanders in the deep command bunker, where maps covered with red pins showed the estimated positions of over 40,000 enemy soldiers, arranged in concentric circles around their shrinking perimeter. The situation had become so desperate that evacuation was being considered for the first time since the siege began, but the colonel made it clear that abandoning Sanh would be seen as a major victory for the North Vietnamese and could influence the outcome of the entire war. The enemy bombardment on February 16th exceeded anything the Marines had experienced before, with over 800 rounds of mixed artillery falling on the base in a 12-hour period that turned day into night with smoke and dust. Captain Mitchell's bunker took a direct hit from a North Vietnamese rocket that killed 3 Marines instantly and wounded 7 others, including Mitchell himself, who continued commanding his company despite shrapnel wounds that would have sent most men to the hospital. Sergeant Major Harper organized a desperate defense of the ammunition dump when North Vietnamese sappers penetrated the perimeter under cover of the massive artillery barrage, leading a counterattack that resulted in vicious hand-to-hand combat among the stacked ordnance containers. The fighting was so close and brutal that Marines and North Vietnamese soldiers literally fought to the death with bayonets, knives, and bare hands while explosions rocked the ground beneath their feet. The medical situation reached crisis proportions, as Corpsman Washington found himself treating over 60 wounded Marines in facilities designed for 20 patients maximum. He performed emergency surgery by flashlight while shells exploded overhead, working with supplies that were running so low he was forced to reuse bandages and operate without proper anesthesia for many procedures. His heroic efforts saved dozens of lives, but the mounting casualties were a constant reminder of how close the base was to being completely overrun. Military historians later described the defense of Sanh as one of the most sustained displays of courage under fire in American military history, with parallels drawn to the defense of the Alamo and the siege of Bastogne during World War II. First Lieutenant Mahoney's intelligence section intercepted North Vietnamese radio transmissions, indicating that General Giap himself had arrived to personally oversee the final phase of the offensive, bringing with him additional artillery regiments and elite assault troops specially trained for urban combat. This news spread through the Marine positions like wildfire, adding another layer of psychological pressure to men who were already operating at the absolute limits of human endurance. The weather continued to work against the defenders as heavy monsoon rains grounded most air support, made the runway unusable for all but the most essential supply flights. Marines learned to operate in conditions that would have been considered impossible just weeks earlier, maintaining their weapons and equipment in the constant mud and humidity while subsisting on reduced rations that barely provided enough calories to sustain combat operations. The tunnel threat became increasingly serious, as seismic sensors detected extensive underground activity on multiple sides of the perimeter, forcing the Marines to deploy precious manpower in listening posts designed to detect enemy tunneling operations. These positions were among the most dangerous on the base, staffed by volunteers who knew they would likely be the first to die if North Vietnamese sappers succeeded in breaching the defensive lines through underground passages. As February drew to a close, the siege had lasted 39 days with no indication that relief was imminent. and every Marine at Sanh understood that they were fighting not just for their base, but for their lives and the reputation of the Corps. The mental and physical toll had been enormous, but their determination remained unbroken despite casualties that had reduced some companies to less than half their original strength, proving that American fighting spirit could endure even under the most desperate circumstances imaginable. March 1st, 1968, brought the first glimmer of hope to the besieged Marines of Sanh when the sound of approaching helicopters broke through the constant rumble of enemy artillery for the first time in over a week. Lieutenant Rodriguez watched from his bunker as a flight of Marine Corps CH-46 helicopters descended through the morning mist under heavy escort from Cobra gunships, bringing desperately needed medical supplies and fresh ammunition to men who had been fighting on empty stomachs and with nearly depleted weapons for far too long. Operation Niagara, the massive B-52 bombing campaign designed to break up North Vietnamese concentrations around Sanh, had finally begun to show measurable results as aerial reconnaissance revealed significant damage to enemy supply lines and artillery positions. Colonel Lones received intelligence reports indicating that North Vietnamese casualties from the sustained bombing had reached critical levels, forcing General Giap to reconsider his strategy for capturing the Marine base that had become a symbol of American determination in Southeast Asia. The weather began to improve during the first week of March, allowing Marine and Air Force pilots to provide close air support that had been impossible during the worst days of the monsoon season. Captain Mitchell, still recovering from his wounds but refusing medical evacuation, coordinated airstrikes against North Vietnamese positions with deadly precision, using his intimate knowledge of enemy locations gained through 41 days of constant combat to guide bombs and rockets onto targets that had been harassing his Marines for weeks. Sergeant Major Harper noticed a subtle but significant change in the morale of his Marines as word spread that major reinforcements were finally en route to break the siege of Sanh. The 1st Cavalry Division had been airlifted from its coastal bases and was fighting its way overland through North Vietnamese resistance, supported by the largest helicopter assault in military history and preceded by carpet bombing that turned the jungle roads into moonscapes of craters and splintered trees. The North Vietnamese response to these developments was predictably fierce, with enemy artillery increasing to over 1,000 rounds per day as General Giap made his final desperate attempt to overrun Sanh before American reinforcements could arrive. First Lieutenant Mahoney's intelligence section reported massive troop movements as North Vietnamese divisions repositioned themselves for what appeared to be a last-ditch assault designed to capture the base through sheer weight of numbers regardless of casualties. Corpsman Washington found his workload actually decreasing for the first time since the siege began, as improved weather allowed for regular medical evacuation flights and the arrival of additional medical personnel who had volunteered to serve at the besieged base. The psychological effect of this support was enormous, as Marines who had felt abandoned and forgotten suddenly realized that the outside world had not forgotten their sacrifice and was doing everything possible to ensure their survival. The tunnel threat reached its climax on March 8th, when North Vietnamese sappers emerged from underground passages just 50 yards from the main command bunker, forcing Marines to fight a desperate battle in the narrow confines of their own defensive positions. The fighting lasted for over 2 hours and resulted in the deaths of 12 enemy soldiers and 3 Marines, but it also revealed the extent of the tunnel system that had been constructed during weeks of patient digging under cover of artillery bombardments. According to declassified after-action reports, the defense of Sanh required the expenditure of over 100,000 tons of bombs and artillery shells, making it one of the most intensive air campaigns in the history of warfare up to that point. The arrival of the 1st Air Cavalry Division at Landing Zone Stud, just 8 miles from Sanh, marked the beginning of Operation Pegasus, the relief operation that would finally break the siege that had lasted for nearly 2 months. Marines listening to radio communications between the advancing cavalry units at their own command post felt a surge of emotion that many later described as the most intense relief they had ever experienced in their lives. As mid-March approached, Lieutenant Rodriguez and his surviving Marines could see the muzzle flashes of American artillery in the hills to the east, proof that friendly forces were finally close enough to provide direct support after 47 days of isolation and constant combat. The siege was far from over, but for the first time since January 21st, the Marines of Sanh allowed themselves to believe that they might actually survive their ordeal and live to tell the story of their incredible stand against overwhelming odds. The morning of March 30th, 1968, marked the official end of the siege of Sanh when elements of the 1st Air Cavalry Division fought their way through the final North Vietnam East defensive positions and linked up with the Marine defenders who had held their ground for 68 days of continuous combat. Lieutenant Rodriguez stood in the ruins of what had once been the base perimeter and watched cavalry troopers emerge from the jungle like liberating angels, their faces showing the same mixture of exhaustion and determination that has sustained the Marines throughout their incredible ordeal. Colonel Lowndes met the cavalry commander, Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Galloway, in a ceremony that was more emotional than formal as the groups of American soldiers who had fought separate but connected battles finally joined forces against their common enemy. The handshake between these two officers represented not just the end of a siege, but the triumph of American military professionalism and fighting spirit over what had seemed like insurmountable odds just weeks earlier. The statistics of the siege told a story of endurance that defied belief. The Marines had withstood over 7,000 to 7,000 rounds of incoming artillery and rockets, while inflicting an estimated 15,000 casualties on North Vietnamese forces at a cost of fewer than 300 American lives. Captain Mitchell, now wearing the Purple Heart along with his other decorations, marveled at the transformation of his men from the scared teenagers who had first arrived at Sanh into hardened combat veterans who had proven themselves under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Sergeant Major Harper organized the evacuation of wounded Marines who had been waiting weeks for medical treatment more sophisticated than battlefield first aid, watching with pride as young men who had lost limbs and suffered terrible wounds maintained the same fighting spirit that had characterized their defense of the base. These Marines had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to continue fighting despite being terrified, and that lesson would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The tunnel systems that had threatened Sanh throughout the siege were finally cleared by combat engineers using sophisticated detection equipment and controlled explosions that collapsed miles of underground passages. First Lieutenant Mahoney accompanied these engineers as they explored tunnels that extended far beyond anything the Marines had suspected, revealing the incredible effort that North Vietnamese had invested in their attempt to capture what they saw as a symbol of American determination in Southeast Asia. Corporal Washington found himself treating North Vietnamese prisoners who had been wounded in the final fighting, applying the same professional medical care to enemy soldiers that he had provided to Marines throughout the siege. Many of these prisoners were barely teenagers themselves, and Washington was struck by the realization that both sides in this terrible conflict had been asking their youngest and best to pay the ultimate price for political decisions made by old men in distant capitals. The evacuation of Sanh began on April 1st as military planners decided that the strategic value of the base no longer justified the enormous cost of maintaining it against continued North Vietnamese pressure. This decision was controversial among the Marines who had fought so hard to hold the position, but most understood that their real victory had been proving that American forces could not be defeated by siege warfare regardless of the odds against them. The siege of Sanh became a defining moment in the Vietnam War, demonstrating both the courage of American fighting men and the limitations of conventional military tactics against a determined guerrilla enemy fighting on familiar terrain. Lieutenant Rodriguez was among the last Marines to leave Sanh, taking one final look at the landscape that had been transformed by 7 to 7 days of continuous combat. From a lush jungle outpost into a barren wasteland of craters and abandoned fortifications, he carried with him the knowledge that he and his fellow Marines had written a new chapter in the history of American military courage, proving that determination and fighting spirit could overcome even the most desperate circumstances. The legacy of Sanh would outlive all the men who fought there, becoming a symbol of American military tenacity and the unbreakable bond between Marines who had shared the ultimate test of combat. As the helicopters carried the last defenders away from the base they had held against impossible odds, Lieutenant Rodriguez knew that he had participated in something that would be remembered and honored as long as Americans valued courage, sacrifice, and the willingness to stand and fight when retreat would have been easier and safer. The siege was over, but the story of what those Marines had accomplished during 7 to 7 days of hell would inspire future generations of American warriors who faced their own impossible missions and drew strength from the knowledge that ordinary men could accomplish extraordinary things when they refused to surrender their honor or abandon their brothers in arms.